Hey, everyone, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to journey through one of history's most profound collapses, the fall of the Ottoman Empire. For 6 centuries, this empire stretched across 3 continents, ruling over millions of souls from the gates of Vienna to the sands of Yemen. It was an empire that called itself eternal, that believed it was chosen by God to rule until the end of time. But empires, like all things born of human ambition, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. Tonight, we'll explore how the Ottoman Empire, once the terror of Europe, the jewel of Islam, the bridge between East and West, slowly, inexorably crumbled into dust. So, settle in, dim the lights, and let me tell you the story of how a 600-year reign came to its end. This is a story of dreams and nightmares, of glory and decay, of the eternal human struggle between what we aspire to be and what we inevitably become. Every empire begins with a dream, and the Ottoman Empire began with the dream of a man named Osman, a tribal chieftain in the hills of Anatolia in the late 13th century. Legend tells us that Osman once had a vision, a great tree growing from his chest, its branches spreading across the world, sheltering all of humanity beneath its shade. Whether this vision was real or invented by later chroniclers doesn't matter. What matters is that it captured something essential about the Ottoman spirit, the belief that they were destined not just to conquer, but to unite, to bring order to chaos, faith to the faithless, justice to the oppressed. In 1299, Osman declared independence from the dying Seljuk Sultanate. Few, his followers, perhaps 1,000 warriors, maybe less. They controlled a small patch of land in northwestern Anatolia, surrounded by enemies. The Byzantine Empire to the west, rival Turkish Beyks to the east, and the vast and different world beyond. But Osman's descendants had something their enemies lacked, a vision of the future. They didn't just want to raid and pillage like so many tribal confederations. They wanted to build something lasting, something eternal. The early Ottomans were pragmatists wrapped in the cloak of holy war. Yes, they fought in the name of Islam, but they welcomed Christian converts, adopted Byzantine administrative practices, and learned from everyone they conquered. Were synthesizers, borrowers, adapters. They took the best of every civilization they encountered and made it their own. This was their genius, and ultimately their tragedy. For in trying to be everything to everyone, they would eventually become nothing to anyone. By 1326, Osman's son, Orhan, had captured Bura, Ottoman making capital, it the first true. The city's thermal baths, its silk markets, its mosques and madrasas, all spoke of a new kind of Islamic state, one that valued commerce as much as conquest, learning as much as warfare. Orhan was the first Ottoman ruler to mint coins, to establish a regular army, to create the institutions that would outlast him. He married a Byzantine princess, Theodora, daughter of Emperor John Caucasus. It was a marriage that symbolized the Ottoman approach. They would not simply destroy their enemies. They would absorb them, transform them, make them part of something larger. By 1354, they had crossed into Europe, establishing a foothold on the Gallipoli Peninsula. The Byzantines, desperate for allies in their endless civil wars, had actually invited them across the Dinals to help fight their enemies. It was like inviting a wolf into your home to deal with mice. The Ottomans never left. The crossing into Europe was more than a military maneuver. It was a psychological transformation. The Ottomans were no longer just another Anatolian beylik fighting for scraps of the Seljuk inheritance. They were now a European power with European ambitions and European enemies. The land they entered was rich but chaotic. The Byzantine Empire was a shadow of its former self, controlling little more than Constantinople, In a few scattered territories, the Balkans were a patchwork of Serbian despots, Bulgarian czars, and local strongmen, all fighting each other with the desperate fury of men who knew their world was ending. Into this chaos came the Ottomans, offering something that none of the local powers could provide: stability. They didn't come as destroyers, but as organizers. They offered lower taxes than the Byzantine Empire, religious tolerance, and most importantly, protection from the endless wars that had devastated the region for generations. The Ottoman expansion through the Balkans was not a conquest in the traditional sense. It was more like a slow absorption, a gradual process by which local elites found it more profitable to serve the Sultan than to fight him. Some resisted, of course, and were crushed, but many others simply switched sides, keeping their lands and their titles in exchange for loyalty to the new order. This was the Ottoman way, to make resistance seem futile and collaboration seemed profitable. It was a strategy that would serve them well for centuries until the day when it would finally fail them. What followed was a century of almost supernatural expansion. The Ottomans moved through the Balkans like a slow-burning fire, consuming everything in their path. But this wasn't mindless destruction. It was methodical, calculated, almost surgical in its precision. They understood something that many conquerors never grasped: that power comes not from fear alone, but from offering something better than what came before. To the Christian peasants of the Balkans, groaning under the weight of feudal oppression, the Ottomans offered lower taxes, religious tolerance, and social mobility. To ambitious young men, they offered the devshir system, a chance to be taken from their families, converted to Islam, and trained to become the empire's elite administrators and soldiers. It sounds horrific to modern ears, and in many ways it was. The devshir was a form of human taxation, a regular levy of Christian boys who would be torn from their families and forced to serve the state that had conquered them. Imagine the scene: Ottoman officials arriving in a village, examining the boys like livestock, selecting the strongest and brightest to be taken away forever. The parents wept, the children screamed. The officials recorded names in their ledgers with the cold efficiency of bureaucrats. It was a system that violated every natural bond between parent and child, every human instinct to protect one's own. And yet, for a bright peasant boy in 14th century Serbia or Bulgaria, the devshirme might be the only path to power, wealth, and influence. The Ottoman system was brutal, but it was also meritocratic in ways that Christian Europe was not. A shepherd's son from the mountains of Albania could rise to become Grand Vizier, second most powerful man in the empire. A Greek fisherman's boy could command armies and govern provinces. The Janissaries, the elite slave soldiers created through the system, became the backbone of Ottoman military power. They were celibate, disciplined, fanatically loyal to the Sultan. They lived in barracks, trained constantly, and knew no loyalty to the empire that had made them. They were in many ways the perfect soldiers, but they were also something more. They were the living embodiment of the Ottoman paradox. They were slaves who commanded free men, Christians who fought for Islam, foreigners who became more Ottoman than the Turks themselves. They represented everything that was brilliant and terrible about the Ottoman system. The Janissaries wore distinctive white felt caps, carried curved swords, and marched to the sound of military bands that struck terror into the hearts of their enemies. They were forbidden to marry, to own property, to have any loyalty except to the Sultan. In return, they were given the best weapons, the best training, and the promise that they would share in the spoils of conquest. For 2 centuries, they were invincible. They broke the power of the Serbian nobles at Kosovo in 1389. They shattered the last crusade at Nicopolis in 1396. They turned the Byzantine Empire a tiny rump state, isolated and helpless. But even in their moment of triumph, the seeds of future decay were being planted. The Janissaries were becoming a privileged caste, more interested in protecting their own position than in serving the empire. The Devshirme system was creating a ruling class that was increasingly divorced from the Turkish population that had created the empire, and the empire itself was growing too large, too complex, too diverse to be governed by the simple methods that had worked in the early days. Success was breeding the conditions for future failure. In 1389, at the Battle of Kosovo, the Ottomans crushed a coalition of Serbian nobles. The battle became legend. Prince Lazar choosing the heavenly kingdom over the earthly one. Milo Olik assassinating Sultan Murad in his tent. But legends don't change the outcome. Serbia fell, and with it, the last real obstacle to Ottoman dominance in the Balkans. The Battle of Kosovo was more than a military victory. It was a psychological watershed. For the Serbs, it became the defining moment of their national consciousness, the moment when they chose martyrdom over submission. For the Ottomans, it was proof that God was on their side, that their empire was destined to rule the world. But the battle also revealed something troubling about the Ottoman system. Sultan Murad was indeed assassinated during the battle, stabbed by a Serbian knight who had pretended to surrender. The fact that an enemy could get close enough to kill the Sultan suggested that the Ottoman court was becoming dangerously complacent, too trusting of its own invincibility. Murad's son, Bayezid, who succeeded him, was nicknamed the Thunderbolt for the speed of his conquests. He completed the conquest of the Balkans, besieged Constantinople, and seemed poised to create a vast empire stretching from the Danube to the Euphrates. But Bayezid's ambitions brought him into conflict with another great conqueror, Tamerlane, the Mongol warlord who had carved out an empire stretching from India to the Mediterranean. In 1402, at the Battle of Ankara, Tamerlane crushed Bayezid's army and captured the Sultan himself. The defeat was catastrophic. Bayezid died in captivity, possibly by the Ottoman Empire fragmented as his sons fought each other for the throne. For a moment, it seemed like the Ottoman dream might die with its founders' great-grandson, but the empire survived as it would survive many other crises over the centuries. Bayezid's son, Mehmed, emerged victorious from the civil war and began the process of rebuilding. The Ottomans had learned a valuable lesson. They were not invincible, and their enemies were not helpless, but they had also learned that they were resilient, adaptable, capable of recovering from even the most devastating defeats. Constantinople still stood, that ancient city of Constantine, the last flickering ember Roman of the Empire, but it was surrounded now, cut off from the world, slowly strangling in the Ottoman embrace. Its fall was no longer a question of if, but when. For over 1,000 years, Constantinople had been the greatest city in the Christian world. Its walls had turned back Arabs, Bulgars, Russians, and countless other would-be conquerors. It was the city of Hagia Sophia, of the great palace of libraries that held the wisdom of ages. It was quite literally the last remnant of the Roman Empire. But by the 15th century, Constantinople was a shadow of its former self. The city that had once housed 500,000 people now held perhaps 50,000. Entire districts lay in ruins, their houses collapsed, their streets overgrown weeds. The imperial treasury was empty. The army was a joke, and the emperor ruled over little more than the city itself and a few scattered islands. The great walls of Theodosius, which had protected the city for 1,000 years, were crumbling from neglect. The Golden Horn was silted up, its harbors empty. of the merchant ships that had once brought wealth from across the known world. The Hagia Sophia itself, that marvel of Byzantine architecture, was falling apart, its mosaics fading, its dome cracked, and yet, Constantinople, as long as it stood, the Roman Empire, in some form, however attenuated, still existed. As long as a Christian emperor sat on the throne of Constantine, the Muslim conquest of Europe remained incomplete. In 1453, Sultan Mehmed II, barely 21 years old, but already consumed with dreams of glory, decided to finish what his ancestors had started. He would take the city that had defied Islam for 8 centuries. He would become Mehmed the Conqueror. Mehmed was not like his predecessors, where they had been content to squeeze Constantinople slowly, to let it wither on the vine. He was impatient for glory. He had been educated by the best scholars of his age, had read the histories of Alexander and Caesar, and dreamed of surpassing them both. He was also a student of technology, fascinated by the new science of artillery. He commissioned the largest cannons ever built, massive bronze monsters that could hurl stone balls weighing over half a ton. The sound of their firing could be heard for miles, a thunder that announced the arrival of a new age. The siege began in April 1453. Mehmed brought an army of perhaps 80,000 men, supported by a fleet of over 100 ships. Against them stood perhaps 7,000 defenders led by Emperor Constantine XI and a handful of foreign volunteers, including the Genoese captain Giovanni Giustiniani. The siege lasted 57 days. Every morning, the great cannons would thunder, sending their massive stone balls crashing into the ancient walls. Every night, the defenders would work frantically to repair the damage, hauling stones and timber in darkness, knowing that each dawn might bring their doom. The walls that had protected Constantinople for 1,000 years began to crumble. The great cannon, nicknamed Basilica by the Turks, could punch holes 20 feet wide in the fortifications, but the defenders fought with the desperation of men who knew they were witnessing the end of the world. Constantine XI, last of the Caesars, was everywhere during the siege. He walked the walls, encouraging his men, sharing their dangers, refusing all Ottoman offers to surrender. He knew that he was fighting not just for his city, but for his place in history. He would not be remembered as the emperor who gave up Constantinople without a fight. The siege was not just a military operation. It was a clash of civilizations, a final confrontation between the Christian and Islamic worlds. Both sides understood what was at stake. If Constantinople fell, it would be more than the end of the Byzantine Empire. It would be the end of an era. Mehmed tried every stratagem he could think of. He built a pontoon bridge across the Golden Horn to attack the city from an unexpected direction. He tunneled under the walls only to have his mines detected and destroyed by the defenders. He offered terms. The city could surrender and be spared, or it could fight and face the consequences. Constantine refused all offers. "It is not in my power," he said, "to surrender the city to you. It is in the power of God and of my people to defend it." He would die as an emperor, not live as a vassal. The final assault began before dawn on May 29, 1453. The Janissaries poured through the breaches in the wall, like a dark tide, their white caps gleaming in the morning light, their curved swords flashing. The defenders fought desperately, but they were overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese had become the soul of the defense, was wounded and carried from the walls. His departure broke the morale of the defenders. The Janissaries pressed forward, climbing over the bodies of the dead, pouring into the city like water through a broken dam. Emperor Constantine, last of the Caesars, stripped off his imperial regalia and died fighting in the streets like a common soldier. His body was never found, lost among the thousands of corpses that littered the city. Some say he was recognized by his purple boots and given a proper burial. Others claim he was thrown into a common grave, his identity lost forever. When Mehmed entered Hagia Sophia that afternoon, he found it empty, except for a few terrified priests. The great church, that had been the heart of Eastern Christianity for 900 years, fell silent. The mosaics of Christ and the Virgin Mary looked down on a new master, a young sultan who had just achieved what no Muslim ruler before him had managed. Within hours, the church would be converted to a mosque. The Christian symbols would be covered with plaster. The altar would be replaced with a map pointing toward Mecca, and the call to prayer would echo where once the divine liturgy had been sung. The Roman Empire, which had endured for over 2,000 years in one form or another, was finally dead. In its place stood something new. The Ottoman Empire, master of 3 continents, heir to Rome and Byzantium, both. But even his moment of triumph, Mehmed must have felt the weight of what he had destroyed. Constantinople had been more than just a city. It had been a repository of human knowledge, a bridge between the ancient and medieval worlds, a symbol of continuity stretching back to the time of Christ. Now it was gone, and something irreplaceable had been lost forever. The Ottomans had gained an empire, but the world had lost a piece of its soul. What followed was the Ottoman Golden Age, a century and a half of expansion that seemed to have no limits. Under Salem, conquered the Mamluk Sultanate, adding Egypt and the Levant to their domains. Under Selim the Magnificent, they pushed deep into Europe, besieging Vienna itself in 1529. At its height, the Ottoman Empire stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Indian Ocean, from the Crimean Peninsula to the cataracts of the Nile. It controlled the holy cities of Mecca and Medina, making the Sultan the protector of Islam's most sacred sites. It commanded the trade routes between Europe and Asia, growing rich on the taxes levied on silk and spices. But even at the moment of its greatest triumph, the empire was changing in ways that would prove fatal. The conquest of the Arab lands brought immense wealth, but it also brought new challenges. How do you govern an empire that spans 3 continents and encompasses dozens of different peoples, languages, and traditions? The Ottomans' answer was the millet system, a form of religious autonomy that allowed Christians and Jews to govern themselves in matters of personal law. It was tolerant by the standards of the age, but it also meant that the empire never truly integrated its diverse populations. They remained separate communities, bound to the state by taxes and military service, but never truly Ottoman in their hearts. The millet system was both the empire's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. It allowed the Ottomans to rule over an incredibly diverse population without the constant rebellions that plagued other empires. Christians could worship in their churches, Jews in their synagogues, each community following its own laws and customs. But it also meant that the empire was really a collection of separate societies held together only by the person of the Sultan and the power of the state. There was no Ottoman nation, no shared identity that transcended religious boundaries. When that central authority began to weaken, there would be nothing to hold the empire together. More dangerous still was what was happening at the center of power. The early Ottoman sultans had been warriors, men who led their armies from the front and knew the empire intimately. Osman had been a tribal chieftain or Hana city builder. Mehmed the Conqueror, young man obsessed with glory and achievement. But as the empire grew larger and more complex, the sultans retreated into the palace surrounded by eunuchs, concubines, and courtiers. The Topkapi Palace in Istanbul became a world unto itself, a labyrinth of courtyards and chambers where the sultan lived in splendid isolation from his subjects. The harem, once a private household, became a political institution. The sultan's mother, the valid sultan, often wielded more real power than the grand vizier. The sultan's wives and concubines schemed and plotted, each trying to ensure that her son would inherit the throne. Princes were no longer sent to govern provinces where they might learn statecraft and military command. Instead, they were kept in the palace in luxurious apartments that were really gilded cages. They were educated by eunuchs and tutors, but they had no real experience of the world they would one day rule. This was the beginning of what historians call the Sultanate of Women, a period when the empire was effectively ruled by the mothers, wives, and sisters of weak sultans. It wasn't necessarily worse than ruled by men. Some of these women were remarkably capable. Kosum Sultan, who dominated Ottoman politics for much of the 17th century, was a shrewd politician and an effective administrator, but it represented a fundamental shift away from the warrior ethos that had built the empire. The sultans were becoming figureheads, isolated from their subjects, dependent on others for information about their own domains. The janissaries, too, were changing. Once celibate, disciplined, they now married, had children, and passed their positions down to their sons. They became a hereditary caste, more interested in protecting their privileges than in fighting the empire's enemies. They began to interfere in politics, deposing sultans who threatened their interests. In 1526, the janissaries revolted against Sultan Salem to reform the military. They surrounded the palace, demanded the dismissal of the Grand Vizier, and forced the Sultan to abandon his plans. It was a sign of things to come. The empire's own elite troops becoming an obstacle to necessary change. The empire was becoming sclerotic, rigid, resistant to change, coming whether they were ready for it or not. In the universities of Europe, scholars were making discoveries that would revolutionize human understanding of the natural world. In the shipyards of Portugal and Spain, navigators were finding new routes to Asia that would bypass Ottoman territory entirely. The Ottomans, secure in their power and confident in their superiority, paid little attention to these developments. They had defeated every enemy, conquered every rival, accumulated wealth beyond imagination. Why should they change a system that had brought them such success? But the world was changing around them, and empires that fail to adapt are doomed to decline. The Ottoman Golden Age was ending, though few at the time realized it. The empire had reached its zenith, and from here, there was only one direction to go. The first sign that the Ottoman tide was turning came in 1683, at the Second Siege of Vienna. For 2 months, a massive Ottoman army, perhaps 200,000 strong, surrounded the city. It seemed like 1453 all over again, like the unstoppable Ottoman war machine would finally break into the heart of Europe. The Grand Vizier Kam Mustafa Pasha had convinced Sultan Mehmed IV that Vienna was ripe for the taking. The Holy Roman Empire was distracted by wars with France. The Austrians were weak, and the city's defenses were outdated. It would be, he promised, an easy victory that would open the road to Rome itself. But this time was different. The Austrians held firm, aided by Polish cavalry under King John Sobieski. The siege dragged on through the summer, with the Ottomans slowly digging their way toward the city walls, while the defenders grew more desperate with each passing day. Inside Vienna, the situation was becoming critical. Food was running short, disease was spreading, and the city's walls were beginning to crumble under the constant bombardment. The Austrian commander, Count Ernst Rudiger von Starberg sent increasingly frantic messages to the Holy Roman Emperor, begging for relief. But help was coming. A coalition army of Austrians, Poles, and Germans was assembling under the command of King John Swazy of Poland. On September 12, 1683, they launched the largest cavalry charge in history, 18,000 horsemen thundering down from the hills around Vienna like an avalanche of steel and horse flesh. The Ottoman lines, weakened by months of siege warfare and overconfident in their superiority, shattered like glass. The Janissaries, who had seemed invincible for 2 centuries, broke and ran. The Grand Vizier fled the field, leaving behind his tent, his treasure, and his reputation. The siege collapsed in a matter of hours. The Ottoman army fled in panic, abandoning their cannons, their supplies, and their dreams of European conquest. King Sois entered Vienna in triumph, and legend says he sent a message to the Pope. Paraphrasing Caesar, Veni vidi Deus vicit, I came, I saw, God conquered. It was more than a military defeat. It was a psychological turning point. For 2 centuries, the Ottomans had seemed invincible, the scourge of Christendom, the sword of Islam. Now suddenly, they looked mortal. The defeat at Vienna shattered the myth of Ottoman invincibility. Across Europe, church bells rang in celebration. The Pope declared a day of thanksgiving. The Ottoman Empire, which had struck fear into the hearts of Christians for generations, had been revealed as fallible. What followed was a cascade of defeats. The Holy League, Austria, Poland, Venice, and Russia carved away Ottoman territories. In the Balkans, Prince Eugene of Savoy, the brilliant Austrian general, won victory after victory against Ottoman forces that seemed to have lost their fighting spirit. The Ottomans, who had once been the masters of siege warfare, now found themselves on the defensive. Their fortresses fell one by one. Grade, Bui, Novi Sad, that had once expanded relentlessly, was now contracting, losing territory for the first time in its history. The Treaty of Carlos in 1699 forced the Ottomans to cede Hungary, Transylvania, and most of their Balkan conquests. For the first time in their history, the Ottomans had to give up significant territory in a peace treaty. The empire that had never known defeat was learning the bitter taste of humiliation. But the real crisis wasn't military, it was economic and technological. While the Ottomans had been focused on conquest and administration, Western Europe had been undergoing a revolution, the scientific revolution, the age of exploration, the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution. All of these passed the Ottoman Empire by. The discovery of sea routes to Asia round the Cape of Good Hope devastated Ottoman trade revenues. Why pay Ottoman taxes on silk and spices when you could sail directly to India and China? The empire's economy built on controlling the trade routes between Europe and Asia began to crumble. Portuguese and Dutch ships were now carrying the goods that had once made Ottoman merchants rich. The great trading cities of the empire, Aleppo, Damascus, Cairo, began to decline. Commerce shifted to the Atlantic routes. The empire's tax revenues fell, making it harder to maintain the armies and bureaucracy that held the state together. Meanwhile, European military technology was advancing rapidly. The Ottomans had been innovators. They were among the first to use cannons effectively in siege warfare. But by the 18th century, they were falling behind. Their armies still relied on tactics and weapons that had been cutting edge. 2 centuries earlier, European armies were becoming more professional, better trained, and better equipped. They had standardized uniform drill and officers trained in militaremies. The Ottoman army, by contrast, was still largely feudal, irregular troops and outdated equipment. The empire's financial system, too, was becoming obsolete. While European states were developing banking systems and national debts, the Ottomans still relied on tax farming, selling the right to collect taxes to the highest bidder. It was a system that encouraged corruption and short-term thinking. Tax farmers had No incentive to develop the regions they control or to invest in long-term improvements. They simply squeezed as much money as possible out of the peasants during their term of office, then moved on. The result was economic stagnation and growing resentment among the empire's subjects. Most dangerous of all, the empire was losing its ideological coherence. The early Ottomans had been driven by a sense of mission to spread Islam, to bring justice to the world, to fulfill God's plan for humanity. But by the 18th century, that sense of mission was fading. The empire was becoming just another state concerned with survival rather than transformation. The sultans were no longer warrior kings leading holy wars, but palace-bound autocrats, more interested in their own comfort than in the welfare of their subjects. The Ottoman Empire was entering what historians call its long decline. A period of military defeats, economic stagnation, and political decay that would last for more than 2 centuries. The empire would survive, but it would never again be the dominant power it had once been. By the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had acquired a new nickname in European diplomatic circles, the sick man of Europe. It was a cruel but not inaccurate description. The empire was clearly in decline, losing territory to Russia in the north, struggling with rebellions in the Balkans, and falling further behind Europe economically and technologically. The phrase was supposedly coined by Tsar Nicholas I of Russia, who told the British ambassador in 1853 that we have on our hands a sick man, a very sick man. Caesar was proposing that Britain and Russia divide up the Ottoman Empire between them like doctors deciding how to dispose of a terminal patient's estate. But the Ottomans were not passive victims of their decline. Throughout the 19th century, a series of reform-minded sultans and administrators attempted to modernize the empire, to adapt it to the realities of the modern world. These efforts, known collectively as the Tanzimat or reorganization, presented one of the most ambitious attempts at reform in history. The need for reform was obvious to anyone with eyes to see. The empire had suffered a series of humiliating defeats at the hands of Russia, losing the Crimea in 1783, and much of the northern Black Sea coast in subsequent wars. The Janissaries had become a reactionary force, opposing all attempts at military modernization and frequently deposing sultans who threatened their privileges. The empire's finances were the traditional system of tax farming had broken down, leaving the central government chronically short of revenue. The military was obsolete, the bureaucracy was corrupt, and the empire's Christian subjects were increasingly restless. Mahmud II, who ruled from 1808 to 1839, was perhaps the most radical reformer. He understood that the empire could not survive without fundamental changes, and he was willing to use extreme measures to achieve them. In 1826, he took the ultimate step. He destroyed the Janissaries, the elite corps that had once been the backbone of Ottoman power. Had become a reactionary force, opposing all attempts at military modernization. They had deposed sultans, interfered in politics, and turned their barracks into centers of sedition. Mahmud lured them into their barracks in Istanbul and had them massacred by artillery fire. It was brutal, but it cleared the way for the creation of a modern army. The event became known as the Auspicious Incident, a euphemism that barely concealed the horror of what had happened. Thousands of Janissaries died in the bombardment, their barracks reduced to rubble, their centuries-old traditions destroyed in a single morning. It was the end of an era, the final break with the military system that had built the empire. But Mahmud's reforms went far beyond military matters. He established new schools, built roads and telegraph lines, and began the process of creating a modern bureaucracy. He allowed his subjects to dress in European fashion, breaking down the rigid dress codes that had separated Muslims from Christians, officials from commoners. The Tanzimat reforms that followed were even more sweeping. They established equality before the law for all Ottoman subjects, regardless of religion. They created a modern educational system, built railways and telegraph lines, and attempted to create a sense of Ottoman citizenship that transcended religious and ethnic divisions. The Hatti Sharif of Gulhana, issued in 1839, promised that all Ottoman subjects would enjoy security, honor, and property. It abolished tax, farming, established regular salaries for government officials, and public trials for all accused of crimes. The Hatti Humayun of 1856 went even further, promising complete equality between Muslims and non-Muslims. Christians and Jews could now serve in the army, hold government positions, and testify in court on equal terms with Muslims. It was a revolutionary change in a society that had been based on religious hierarchy for centuries, but the reforms faced enormous obstacles. Conservative religious authorities opposed changes that seemed to undermine Islamic law. The Ulama, the class of Islamic scholars and judges, saw the reforms as an attack on their authority and the divine order of society. Ethnic minorities, particularly in the Balkans, were more interested in independence than in Ottoman citizenship. The Greeks had already won their independence in the 1820s, and other Christian peoples were beginning to dream of following their example. And the European powers, despite their rhetoric about reform, often preferred a weak Ottoman Empire that they could manipulate. They were happy to see the Ottomans modernize their military and administration, but they had no interest in seeing the empire become strong enough to challenge their own interests in the region. The Greek War of Independence, which began in 1821, was a harbinger of things to come. The Greeks, inspired by European nationalism and supported by Britain, France, and Russia, fought for 8 years to break free from Ottoman rule. The war was brutal, marked by massacres on both sides. The Ottomans hanged the Greek Patriarch of Constantinople in retaliation for the rebellion, while Greek rebels slaughtered Turkish civilians in the Peloponnese. It was a preview of the ethnic conflicts that would tear the empire apart in the coming century. The war ended with Greek independence in 1830. But not before it had demonstrated the empire's weakness. The Ottomans had been unable to suppress the rebellion on their own and had been forced to call on their Egyptian vassal, Muhammad Ali, for help. Even then, they had only been defeated by the intervention of the European powers. More revolts followed. Serbia gained autonomy in 1817 and full independence in 1878. Romania, Bulgaria, provinces broke away. One by one, loss weakened the Ottoman Empire's European, both economically and psychologically. The Crimean War of 1856 offered a brief respite. Britain and France, worried about Russian expansion, lined with the Ottomans, their traditional enemy. The war was a disaster for all involved. Hundreds of thousands died from disease and incompetence. But it did halt Russian expansion for a generation. Yet even this victory came at a cost. The war left the Ottoman Empire deeply in debt to European banks. By 1875, the empire was spending more than half its budget on debt service. In 1876, it declared bankruptcy, and European creditors took control of Ottoman finances through the Ottoman Public Debt Administration. The empire was becoming a semicolon, formally independent, economically controlled by foreign powers. It was a humiliating position for a state that had once been the terror of Europe. The reforms of the Tanzimat period were impressive in their scope and ambition, but they came too late and faced too much opposition to save the empire. The Ottoman state was like a patient undergoing surgery while still fighting a war. The operation might be necessary, but the timing was disastrous. As the 19th century drew to a close, a new generation of Ottoman intellectuals and officers began to organize in secret. They called themselves the Committee of Union and Progress. but history knows them as the Young Turks. They were educated, westernized, and deeply frustrated with the empire's decline. These young men had grown up watching their empire lose war after war, territory after territory, prestige after prestige. They had seen carve up Ottoman lands like a Christmas turkey, while the Sultan and his ministers seemed powerless to stop them. The Young Turks believed that the empire could be saved, but only through radical transformation. They wanted to create a modern centralized state based on Ottoman nationalism rather than Islamic identity. They wanted to industrialize the economy, modernize the military, and create a sense of shared citizenship among all the empire's peoples. Their intellectual leader was a man named Ahmed Riza, who had studied in Paris and absorbed the ideas of French positivism. He believed that the empire's problems could be solved through the application of scientific principles to government and society. Progress, he argued, was not just possible but inevitable if only the empire could free itself from the dead weight of tradition and superstition. But the Young Turks were not just intellectuals. They were also conspirators. They organized in secret cells, communicated through coded messages, and planned for the day when they could seize power and implement their vision of reform. Their opportunity came in 1908 when a group of young Turk officers in Macedonia launched a revolt against Sultan Abdul Hamid II. The Sultan, faced with the choice between civil war and capitulation, chose to restore the constitution he had suspended 30 years earlier. For a brief moment, it seemed like the empire might be reborn. Christians and Muslims celebrated together. In the streets of Istanbul, the parliament reconvened after decades of suspension. There was talk of a new Ottoman identity that would unite all the empire's peoples: Turks, Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Jews. The Young Turk Revolution was greeted with euphoria throughout the empire. In Salonika, the birthplace of the movement, crowds gathered in the streets, chanting liberty, equality, fraternity. In Istanbul, political prisoners were released from jail too. Even in the remote provinces, there was a sense that a new era was beginning. But the euphoria was short-lived. The Young Turk Revolution unleashed forces that proved impossible to control. Bulgaria declared independence, taking advantage of the chaos to break free from even nominal Ottoman suzerainty. Austria-Hungary annexed Bosnia and territories it had been occupying since 1878. Crete announced its union with Greece despite Ottoman protests. Empire's enemies, sensing weakness, moved quickly to grab what they could. In a matter of months, the Ottomans lost more territory than they had in the previous century. The revolution that was supposed to save the empire seemed to be accelerating its collapse. Worse still, the Young Turks' vision of Ottoman nationalism proved to be a fantasy. The empire's Christian minorities had no interest in becoming Ottoman patriots. They had their own national movements, their own dreams of independence. The Greeks wanted to unite with Greece, the Bulgarians with Bulgaria, the Serbs with Serbia, and the empire's Muslim populations, Arabs, Kurds, Albanians, were developing their own nationalist movements. Who made up perhaps 40% of the empire's population, were beginning to dream of an independent Arab state. The Kurds scattered across the empire's eastern provinces were developing their own sense of national identity. The Young Turks responded to these challenges with increasing authoritarianism. They centralized power in Istanbul, suppressed minority languages, and tried to impose Turkish culture on the empire's diverse populations. The very reforms meant to save the empire were tearing it apart. The policy of Turkification was particularly disastrous. The Young Turks believed that the empire could only survive if all its peoples became Turkish in language and culture. They closed minority schools, banned minority newspapers, and forced government employees to speak Turkish. But this policy only alienated the empire's populations further. The Arabs, who had been relatively loyal to the Ottoman state, began to organize their own Nationalist movements. The Armenians, who had hoped that the Young Turk Revolution would bring them equality and security, found themselves increasingly persecuted. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 were the final blow to Ottoman Europe. A coalition of Balkan states, Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, attacked the empire and drove it almost entirely. The First Balkan War began in October 1912, when Montenegro declared war on the Ottoman Empire. Within days, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Greece had joined the attack. The Ottoman forces, demoralized, collapsed and poorly almost immediately. In just 2 months, the Balkan allies had conquered almost all of the empire's remaining European territories. Adrianople, the ancient capital of the Ottoman Empire, fell to the Bulgarians. Salonika, the young Turk movement, was occupied by the Greeks. The empire that had once besieged Vienna was now reduced to a small foothold around Istanbul. The Second Balkan War, fought in 1913, saw the Balkan allies turn on each other over the division of the spoils. The Ottomans managed to recapture Adrianople, but it was a small consolation for the loss of most of their European empire. In just 2 years, the Ottomans lost 80% of their European territory and 70% of their European population. The psychological impact for 6 centuries. The Ottomans had been a European power. Now, they were an Asian state with European pretensions. The empire that had once stretched from the gates of Vienna to the Indian Ocean was now reduced to Anatolia, the Arab provinces, and a tiny foothold in Europe. The Young Turks, who had promised to save the empire, had presided over its greatest territorial losses since the empire's founding. The Young Turks, desperate to restore the empire's fortunes, began to look for allies. And in 1914, they found one in Germany, another empire that felt encircled and threatened by its enemies. When the First World War began in July 1914, the Ottoman Empire faced a terrible choice. They could remain neutral and hope to survive the conflict intact, or they could choose a side and risk everything on the outcome. The empire was in no condition to fight a world war. The Balkan Wars had left it exhausted and demoralized. The army was poorly equipped and trained. The treasury was empty, and the government was divided between competing factions. But the Young Turk leadership, dominated by the triumvirate of Enver Pasha, Talat Pasha, and Jamal Pasha, chose to gamble. In November 1914, they entered the war on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary, hoping that a Central Powers victory would restore the empire's lost territories and prestige. It was a decision born of desperation and delusion. Enver Pasha, the de facto leader of the empire, was convinced that Germany would win quickly and that the Ottomans would share in the spoils. He dreamed of a new Ottoman Empire stretching from the Balkans to Central Asia, uniting all the Turk peoples under Ottoman rule. Enver was a man intoxicated by his own ambitions. He had played a key role in the Young Turk Revolution, had helped depose Sultan Abdul Hamid, and now saw himself as the savior of the empire. He was young, charismatic, and utterly convinced of his own destiny. But Enver's dreams were built on sand. The Ottoman Empire was not the great power it had once been. Its army was a shadow of the force that had once terrorized Europe. Its economy was dependent on foreign loans. Its population was war-weary and increasingly disloyal. Was very different from Enver's fantasies. The war was a catastrophe for the Ottoman Empire from the very beginning. Enver's attempt to invade Russian territory in the Caucasus ended in disaster at the Battle of Sarakamish, where an entire Ottoman army was destroyed by the cold and the Russians. The campaign began in December 1914 with Enver personally leading an army of 90,000 men into the mountains of eastern Anatolia in the depths of winter. It was madness. The troops were poorly equipped for winter warfare. The supply lines were inadequate, and the Russians were well prepared for the attack. Of the 90,000 men who began the campaign, fewer than 10,000 returned. The rest died of cold, hunger, disease, or Russian bullets. Entire regiments simply vanished. Their bodies not found until the spring thaw. It was one of the most complete military disasters in history. The defeat at Saki Kamish had consequences far beyond the immediate military losses. It convinced the Young Turk leadership that the empire's Armenian population was collaborating with the Russians, setting the stage for the genocide that would follow. The British and French, meanwhile, launched their own offensive against the empire. The Gallipoli campaign of 1915 was meant to knock the Ottomans out of the war quickly by capturing Istanbul and opening a supply route to Russia. The campaign began with a naval attack on the Dardanelles in March 1915. British and French warships attempted to force their way through the straits, but they were repelled by Ottoman mines and shore batteries. Several ships were sunk, and the naval attack was abandoned. The Allies then decided on a land invasion. On April 25, 1915, British, French, Australian, and New Zealand forces landed. They expected to sweep aside the Ottoman defenders and march on Istanbul within days. But the Ottomans, led by a young colonel named Mustafa Kemal, fought with desperate courage. The invaders were pinned down on the beaches, unable to advance more than a few miles inland. What was supposed to be a quick victory turned into a bloody stalemate. The Gallipoli campaign lasted 8 months and cost both sides enormous casualties. The Ottomans lost over 200,000 men defending the peninsula, but they held their ground. Allies, after suffering similar losses, finally evacuated in January 1916. The victory at Gallipoli was bright spots in the Ottoman war effort. It made Mustafa Kemal a national hero and proved that the empire could still fight when its back was against the wall. But it was a defensive victory, and the empire needed offensive successes to have any hope of winning the war. Even more devastating than the military defeats was the Arab Revolt, which began in 1916. The Sharif of Mecca Hussein ibn Ali proclaimed Arab independence and launched a guerrilla war against Ottoman rule. The revolt was encouraged and supported by the British, who saw it as a way to weaken the Ottoman Empire from within. British agents, including the famous Lawrence of Arabia, provided the Arab rebels with weapons, money, and military advice. Arab revolt was a devastating blow to Ottoman morale. The Arabs had been among the most loyal subjects of the empire, and their rebellion seemed to prove that the Ottoman ideal of unity and diversity was dead. If the Arabs, who shared the same religion as the Turks, could rebel, what hope was there of keeping the empire together? The revolt also had serious strategic consequences. It tied down thousands of Ottoman troops who were desperately needed on other fronts. It severed the empire's connection to its Arabian provinces, cutting off important sources of revenue and manpower. But the greatest tragedy of the war was the Armenian genocide. Convinced that the empire's Armenian population was collaborating with the Russians, the Young Turk government ordered the deportation of Armenians from eastern Anatolia in April 1915. What followed was systematic mass murder. Over 1 million Armenians died in what was one of the first genocides of the 20th century. Men were shot, women and children were marched into the desert to die of thirst and starvation, and entire communities were wiped out. The genocide was not just a moral catastrophe, it was also a strategic disaster. The Armenians had been among the empire's most educated and economically productive citizens. They had been merchants, craftsmen, professionals, the empire's middle class. Their destruction weakened the empire at the very moment when it needed all its strength. The genocide also damaged the empire's reputation internationally. Reports of the massacres reached the outside world, public opinion against the Ottomans, and making it harder for Germany to justify its alliance with them. By 1918, the Ottoman Empire was collapsing on all fronts. In Palestine, British forces under General Edmund captured Jerusalem and were advancing toward Damascus. In Mesopotamia, British and Indian troops had occupied Baghdad, pushing north toward Mosul. In the Caucasus, the Russians had been replaced by the British, who were supporting Armenian and Georgian independence movements. The empire's economy had collapsed. Inflation was rampant. Food government was printing money to pay its bills. The population was starving. Disease was spreading, and desertion from the army was becoming epidemic. In October 1918, the empire signed an armistice with the Allies, effectively ending its participation in the war. The terms were harsh. The Allies would occupy the straits, the army would be demobilized, and the empire would surrender its remaining territories in the Arab world. The 600-year-old empire had gambled everything on one final throw of the dice, and it had lost everything. The end of the First World War brought not peace, but partition. The victorious allies Britain, France, Italy, and Greece descended the Ottoman Empire, like vultures on a carcass, each determined to claim their share of the spoils. The armistice signed at Mudros in October 1918 was just the beginning. The real dismemberment of the empire would come with the peace treaty, and the Allies were in no mood to be generous to a defeated enemy that had cost them so much blood and treasure. The Treaty of C, signed in August 1920, was meant to be the Ottoman Empire's death warrant. It reduced the empire to a small rump state in central Anatolia, surrounded by hostile neighbors, and dependent on Allied goodwill for its very survival. Under the terms of the treaty, the straits would be internationalized and placed under Allied control. Armenia would become an independent state in eastern Anatolia. Kurdistan would receive autonomy with the possibility of full independence if the League of Nations approved. The Arab provinces would be divided between Britain and France as League of Nations mandates. Most humiliatingly of all, Greece was awarded large portions of western Anatolia, including the great city of Izmir. Greek armies had landed in May 1919 and begun to advance inland, dreaming of recreating the Byzantine Empire and fulfilling the great idea of uniting all Greeks under one flag. The Greek occupation was particularly galling to the Turks. The Greeks were not just foreign invaders, they were former subjects of the empire, Christians, who had lived under Ottoman rule for centuries. Their occupation of Turkish soil seemed to symbolize the complete reversal of fortune that had befallen the empire. The treaty also imposed severe restrictions on the Turkish military. The army was limited to 50,000 men, the navy to a few small vessels, and the air force was banned entirely. Turkey would be defenseless, dependent on the Allies for protection against its enemies. Financially, the treaty was equally devastating. Turkey would be required to pay massive reparations to the Allies, and its finances would be controlled by an international commission, the Ottoman Public Debt Administration, which had already taken control of much of the empire's revenue, would be expanded and given even greater powers. It seemed like the end of the story. The Ottoman Empire, which had once ruled 3 continents, was being carved up by its enemies like a defeated animal. The Sultan Mehmed VI was a powerless figurehead dependent on Allied protection for his very survival, but the Allies had made a crucial miscalculation. They had assumed that the Turkish people, exhausted by years of war and defeat, would accept partition passively. They had forgotten that the Turks whatever their other faults, had never been a people to submit quietly to foreign domination. In the ruins of the empire, a new leader was emerging. Mustafa Kemal, the hero of Gallipoli, unlike the discredited young Turk leadership, Kemal had a clear vision of the future. He would create a new Turkish state from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire, a state that would be modern, secular, and nationalist. Kemal understood something that the Allies did not, that the age of empires was ending. The future belonged to nation-states, not to multi-ethnic empires. By embracing Turkish nationalism and abandoning the Ottoman dream of universal empire, mobilized energies that the old regime could never have tapped. In May 1919, Kemal landed in the Black Sea port of Samsun with a small group of followers. Officially, he was there to oversee the demobilization of Ottoman forces in accordance with the armistice terms. In reality, he was beginning a revolution that would transform the Middle East. The Turkish War of Independence that followed was one of the most remarkable military and political achievements of the 20th century. Against overwhelming odds, Kemal and his followers created a new army, established a new government in Ankara, and began to fight back against the occupying powers. The war was brutal and desperate. The Greeks advanced deep into Anatolia, coming within 50 miles of Ankara. The French occupied southern Turkey, the Italians held the southwest, and the British controlled the Straits and Istanbul. It seemed impossible that the Turkish resistance could succeed. But Kemal had several advantages that his enemies underestimated. He was fighting on his home ground with the support of the Turkish population. He was a brilliant military strategist and an even more brilliant politician. And his enemies were divided, each pursuing their own agenda rather than working together effectively. Most importantly, Kemal understood the power of nationalism in the modern world. He was not trying to restore the Ottoman Empire. He was creating something entirely new. The Turkish national movement was not burdened by the empire's legacy of defeat and decline. It was a fresh start, a chance to build a modern state from the ground up. The war raged for 3 years from 1919 to 1922. There were moments when it seemed like the Turkish cause was hopeless, when the Greek armies were at the gates of Ankara and the government was preparing to flee to the interior. But Kemal never lost faith in ultimate victory. He understood that this was not just a war for territory, it was a war for the soul of the Turkish people. Either they would win their independence and create a modern nation-state, or they would disappear from history as a free people. The turning point came in August 1922 at the Battle of Dumlupınar. Kemal's forces, now calling themselves the Turkish National Army, launched a massive offensive against the Greek forces in western Anatolia. 12 in just 11 days. They shattered the Greek army and sent it fleeing toward the sea. The Greek retreat became a rout, then a catastrophe. Entire Greek divisions disintegrated under the Turkish assault. Officers abandoned their men, soldiers threw away their weapons, and the dream of a greater Greece died in the dust of Anatolia. 31 The civilian Greek population of western Anatolia, Turkish reprisals, terrified, fled alongside the army. Hundreds of thousands of people, men, women, and children who had lived in Anatolia for generations, abandoned their homes and possessions and headed for the coast, hoping to find ships to carry them to safety. The Great Fire of Izmir in September 1922 marks the end of the Greek presence in Asia Minor after nearly 3,000 years. 1059 The city burned for days, destroying Armenian quarters and erasing centuries of multicultural history. Whether the fire was set deliberately or started accidentally remains a matter of controversy. The Turks blamed retreating Greek soldiers. The Greeks blamed Turkish irregulars and neutral observers were divided. 20 but the result was the same. The cosmopolitan city that had been a symbol of Ottoman diversity was reduced to ashes. By the end of 1922, the Turkish forces had driven all foreign armies from Anatolia. The Treaty of Sèvres was dead, replaced by the Treaty of Lausanne in 1923, which recognized the independence and territorial integrity of the new Turkish state. The Treaty of Lausanne was a remarkable diplomatic achievement for the Turks. 101-49, they had managed to overturn a dictated peace and replace it with a negotiated settlement that recognized their basic demands. Under the new treaty, Turkey would be a sovereign state with secure borders. 102-07, the straits would remain under Turkish control, though they would be demilitarized and open to international shipping. The capitulations, the system of extraterritorial rights that had given foreign powers special privileges in the Ottoman Empire, were abolished. Most importantly, the treaty included a massive population exchange between Turkey and Greece. 102-26, over 1 million Greeks would be expelled from Turkey. Turks would be forced to leave Greece. It was ethnic cleansing on a massive scale, but it was presented as a humanitarian measure to prevent future conflicts. But Kemal's revolution went far beyond military victory. Diplomatic success. In November 1922, he abolished the Sultanate, ending 6 centuries of Ottoman rule. Sultan Mehmed XLIX the Last fled Istanbul aboard a British warship, carrying with him the remnants of a dynasty that had once ruled half the known world. The abolition of the Sultanate was more than a political change. It was a symbolic break with the past. The Ottoman Empire had been built around the person of the Sultan, who was both the political ruler and the religious leader of the Muslim community. By abolishing the Sultanate, Kemal was declaring that the new Turkey would be based on different principles. 103. In October 1923, Kemal proclaimed the Republic of Turkey with himself as its first president. The transformation was complete. The Ottoman Empire was dead, and in its place stood something entirely new, a modern secular nationalist state. Kemal, who would later take the surname Ataturk, father of the Turks, set about remaking Turkish society from top to bottom. 103-50. He abolished the caliphate in 1924, cutting the last Islamic link to the identity. He replaced Islamic law with European legal codes, gave women the vote, and encouraged them to participate in public life. He replaced the Arabic script with the Latin alphabet, cutting the new generation off from their Ottoman past. 104-08, he moved the capital from Istanbul to Ankara, from the cosmopolitan to a small town in the Anatolian heartland. He banned the fez and encouraged Western dress, even personally demonstrating how to wear a hat. Most symbolically of all, he changed the call to prayer from Arabic to Turkish, making Islam itself serve the cause of Turkish nationalism. 104-32. It was a radical transformation would have been unthinkable under the Ottoman system. The transformation was remarkable, but it came at a cost. The new Turkey was ethnically homogeneous in a way that the Ottoman Empire had never been. The Greek population was gone, expelled in the population exchange. The Armenians were gone, victims of genocide and deportation. The Kurds were denied recognition as a separate people and forced to assimilate into Turkish culture. The Ottoman dream of unity and diversity was replaced by the modern nightmare of ethnic nationalism. It was a pattern that would be repeated across the former Ottoman territories from the Balkans to the Middle East. 105-10. For the Turks themselves, the transformation was liberating. They had escaped the burden of empire, the responsibility for governing diverse populations with conflicting interests. They could focus on building a modern nation state, on creating prosperity and security for their own people. 105-29. The Turkish Republic that emerged from the ashes of the Ottoman Empire was not perfect, but it was viable. It survived the challenges of the interwar period, remained neutral, during most of World War II, and eventually became a member of NATO and a candidate for membership. In the European Union, Mustafa Kemal Ataturk had achieved something that few leaders in history have managed. 1. He had created a new nation from the ruins of an old empire. The Ottoman Empire was dead. But the Turkish Republic lived on, a testament to the power of nationalism and the possibility of renewal. Even in the darkest of times, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire didn't end with the proclamation of the Turkish Republic. 10607 Its effects rippled outward like waves from a stone thrown into still water. The modern Middle East and Balkans in ways that are still felt today. The Arab provinces of the Empire were divided between Britain and France as League of Nations mandates, a polite fiction that disguised old-fashioned colonialism. 10628 The British took Iraq, Palestine, and Transjordan, artificial borders drawn by European diplomats with little understanding of local conditions would become sources of conflict for generations. The mandate system was supposed to be temporary, a way of preparing the Arab peoples for eventual independence. 10648 But in practice, it was a way for the European powers to control oil resources and strategic positions without the expense and responsibility of formal colonization. In Palestine, made contradictory promises to both Arabs and Jews during the war. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 had promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. 10712 While at the same time, the British had promised Arab independence in exchange for their support against the Ottomans. The result was a century of conflict that continues to this day. The British found themselves caught between competing nationalisms, unable to satisfy either side. Jewish immigration increased throughout the 1920s and 30s, leading to growing tensions with the Arab population. Tried to limit immigration, which angered the Jews, and then allowed it to continue, which angered the Arabs. The partition of Palestine in 1947 and the creation of Israel in 1948 were the direct result of the Ottoman Empire's collapse and the British Mandate that followed. 10753 The conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, in many ways a continuation of the struggle over the Ottoman inheritance. In Iraq, the British cobbled together 3 Ottoman provinces, Baghdad, Basra, and Mosul, into a single state that has struggled with internal divisions. Since the Sunni Arabs, who had dominated the Ottoman administration, found themselves ruling over a Shia Arab majority and a Kurdish minority, both of whom had their own grievances and aspirations. 10824 The artificial Iraq's borders became apparent almost immediately. The Kurds rebelled in the 1920s. The Shia rose up repeatedly, and the country has never achieved the stability and unity that its creators envisioned. The American invasion of 2003 and the chaos that followed can be traced back to the fundamental contradictions built into Iraq at its creation. 10852 Syria and Lebanon under French mandate faced similar problems. The French divided Syria into several small lines, trying to apply the old Ottoman millet system to modern nationalism. But the artificial divisions only created more problems, and Syria has struggled with sectarian conflict ever since. Lebanon, carved out of Syria to create a Christian majority state, has been torn apart by civil wars and foreign interventions. The delicate balance between Christians and Muslims that the French tried to create has repeatedly broken down, leading to decades of instability and violence. 10930 The Balkans, too, or the scars of Ottoman. The new state of Yugoslavia attempted to unite South Slavs who had been divided by centuries of Ottoman and Austrian rule, but the ethnic and religious divisions were too deep. The memories of past conflicts too fresh. Yugoslavia managed to hold together for most of the 20th century, first under royal rule, and then under communist dictatorship. 109 58. But when the Cold War ended and the communist system collapsed, divisions reasserted themselves with a vengeance. The Yugoslav wars of the 1990s were in many ways a continuation of the conflicts that had begun with the Ottoman retreat from the Balkans. Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, and Albanians fought with a ferocity that shocked the world, but the roots of their hatred lay deep in the Ottoman past. 21. The concept of ethnic cleansing, which became notorious during the Yugoslav wars, it had been practiced during the Ottoman collapse, when Greeks and Turks were forcibly exchanged, when Armenians were deported and massacred, when entire populations were uprooted and relocated. Even Turkey, the most successful successor state, with the legacy of empire. 44. The Kurdish population denied recognition under the new nationalist ideology. Rebellions launched. The memory of the Armenian genocide became a source of international tension, with Turkey refusing to acknowledge what had happened and the Armenian diaspora demanding recognition and reparations. 4. The secular westernizing faced constant challenges from Islamic conservatives who saw it as an abandonment of Turkey's true identity. The tension between secularism and Islam, between westernization and tradition, between Turkish nationalism and Islamic universalism has defined Turkish politics. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Ottoman collapse was psychological. Ottoman Empire had provided a framework for understanding the world, a vision of universal Islamic rule that transcended ethnic and national divisions. Its collapse left a void that has never been filled. 47. The rise of political Islam in the 20th and 21st centuries can be seen in part as an attempt to recreate that lost unity. From the Muslim Brotherhood to ISIS, Islamist movements have dreamed of restoring the caliphate, of reuniting the Muslim world under a single banner. But these movements have failed to understand a crucial truth. 1206. The Ottoman Empire succeeded not because it was purely Islamic, but because it was pragmatic, adaptive. It incorporated the best of many civilizations, Byzantine, Persian, Arab, European, Middle East, and created divided into new. Competing nation states has never achieved the stability and prosperity that the Ottoman Empire provided at its best. 1229. The empire's collapse unleashed forces, nationalism, tear the region apart. The Arab Great Spring of 2011, which began with such hope and ended in such disappointment, can be seen as the latest chapter in the story of Ottoman collapse. The artificial states created from the empire's ruins have struggled to create legitimate governments, prosperous economies, and stable societies. Syria torn apart by civil war. 1301. Iraq has been devastated by sectarian conflict. Libya has collapsed. Yemen has been destroyed by proxy wars. The dream of Arab unity that inspired the revolts against Ottoman rule has given way to the nightmare of Arab division. The Ottoman Empire was far from perfect. 1321. It was an autocracy that denied political rights to its subjects, a religious state that discriminated minorities, an imperial system that exploited its provinces for the benefit of the center. But it also provided a framework for coexistence, a way for different peoples to live together under a single authority. 1340. Nation-states that replaced it have often been more oppressive, more violent, and more unstable than the empire. They succeeded. The dream of national self-determination has too often become the reality of ethnic conflict and religious war. As we reach the end of our journey through the rise and fall of the Ottoman Empire, it's worth asking, what can we learn from this 600-year story? What does the collapse of one of history's greatest empires tell us about power, about change, about the human condition itself? First, it reminds us that nothing lasts forever. The Ottomans believed their 1411 empire was eternal, blessed by God until the end of time. They called it the eternal state, the well-protected domains, the empire that would last until the day of judgment. They were wrong. All human institutions, no matter how powerful or enduring they seem, carry within them the seeds of their own destruction. 1:14:35 The very qualities that make an empire great, its size, its diversity, its complexity, eventually become sources of weakness. The Ottoman Empire of a single catastrophic event, but because of a slow accumulation of problems that it could not solve. 1:14:55 Military defeats, economic decline, administrative corruption, downward spiral confusion that proved impossible. Each problem made the others worse. This is the fate of all empires from Rome to Britain to the Soviet Union. They grow until they become too large to govern effectively, too diverse to hold together, too complex to reform. Success breeds the conditions for future failure. 1:15:21 The danger the Ottoman falling story behind shows. The empire's decline began when it stopped adapting, when it became rigid and conservative, while the world around it was changing rapidly. The scientific revolution, the age of exploration, industrial revolution, all of these passed the Ottomans by, leaving them increasingly obsolete. 1:15 Once been at the forefront of military technology, that had pioneeered the use of gunpowder in warfare, that had built the most advanced administrative system of its age, gradually fell behind its competitors. By the 19th century, Ottoman armies were using tactics and weapons that were centuries out of date. 1:16:01 But the reformers faced an impossible dilemma. Every attempt at modernization threatened the traditional sources of Ottoman legitimacy. How do you reform an Islamic empire using European models? How do you create Ottoman nationalism in a multi-ethnic empire? How do you modernize without losing your identity? The Young Turks tried to solve this dilemma through radical transformation. 1:16:28 But their efforts only accelerated the empire's collapse. Sometimes cannot bend without breaking. The choice becomes not between reform and stagnation, but between transformation and destruction. The Ottoman collapse reminds us of the power of ideas. 1:16:51 The empire fell not just to superior military force or economic pressure, but to new ways of thinking about politics and identity. Nationalism, in particular, proved to be a solvent that dissolved the bonds holding the multi-ethnic empire together. The Ottomans had created a system based on religious rather than ethnic identity. 1:17:12 Muslims, Christians, they were all Ottoman subjects. This system worked for centuries, creating a remarkably stable and tolerant society by the standards of its age, but it could not survive the rise of ethnic nationalism, the idea that each people should have its own state, that political boundaries should correspond to ethnic boundaries, was revolutionary in its implications. 1:17:36 It meant that multi-ethnic empires like the Ottoman Empire were not just obsolete. The tragedy is that the Ottoman vision of unity and diversity was in many ways more humane than the nationalist alternative. The empire at its best was tolerant, cosmopolitan, and inclusive. Its collapse led to ethnic cleansing, genocide, and the creation of ethnically homogeneous nation-states that were often less tolerant than the empire they replaced. 1:18:07 The Ottoman story reminds us that history is not inevitable. Was not predetermined. The empire's at many points, different choices might have led to different outcomes. If the empire had modernized earlier, if it had stayed out of the First World War, if its leaders had been more flexible and pragmatic, who knows what might have happened. 1:18:27 The decision to enter World War I on the side of Germany was perhaps the most fateful choice in Ottoman history. It was a gamble that the empire could not afford to lose, and when it did lose, the consequences were catastrophic. But it was a choice, not an inevitability. 1:18:45 Similarly, the Armenian genocide was not an inevitable result of ethnic. It was a deliberate policy choice made by specific individuals at a specific moment in time. Other choices were possible. Other policies could have been pursued. But history is made by human beings, with all their flaws and limitations. 1905 The Ottoman sultans and statesmen were not mistakes, succumbed to pride and prejudice, and failed to see the consequences of their actions. They were, in other words, human. Fifth, the collapse of the Ottoman Empire shows us the importance of legitimacy in politics. The empire survived for 6 centuries. Not just because of its military power or administrative efficiency, but because its subjects accepted its right to rule. That legitimacy was based on several sources. 1937 gave the Sultan religious authority, military success, which proved God's favor, and practical benefits, which made preferable to the alternatives. As long as these sources of legitimacy remained strong, the empire was stable. But when they began to weaken, when the empire started losing wars, when Islamic law seemed inadequate to modern challenges, when Ottoman rule became more burdensome than beneficial, the empire's legitimacy crumbled. No amount of force could compensate for the loss of popular acceptance. This is a lesson 1:20:15 that applies to all governments, just empires. Power that is based solely on force is inherently unstable. Lasting political authority requires the governed, even if that consent is not formally expressed through democratic institutions. Finally, the Ottoman story reminds us of the complexity of historical change. 1:20:38 The empire's collapse was not simply a decline and fall, but of transformation and renewal. The Turkish Republic that emerged from the empire's ashes was, in many ways, more successful than the empire itself. Turkey today is a modern, prosperous, democratic country that would have been unimaginable under the Ottoman system. 1:21:00 The painful process of imperial collapse, rebirth, however traumatic at the time, may have been necessary for the Turkish people to realize their full potential. Similarly, the Arab peoples who gained independence from Ottoman rule have struggled to create stable, prosperous societies. 1:21:20 But they have also achieved things that would have been impossible under the empire. They have developed their own national cultures, their own political systems, their own relationships with the wider world. The collapse of the Ottoman Empire was a tragedy in many ways. It led to wars, genocides, and decades of instability. 1:21:39 But it was also a liberation, freeing peoples to determine their own destinies and create futures. History is not a simple story of progress or decline, but a complex process of change that involves both loss and gain, both destruction and creation. The end of the Ottoman Empire was not just an ending. 1:22:01 It was also a beginning. Today, if you walk through the streets of Istanbul, you can still see the ghosts of the Ottoman Empire. The great mosques of Selim and Ahmed still dominate the skyline, their minarets reaching toward heaven like prayers made stone. The Topkapi Palace still overlooks the Bosphorus, its courtyards and chambers echoing with the whispers of sultans and vizier long dead. 1:22:31 Bazaar still echoes with the voices of merchants from a dozen different countries, haggling in a dozen different languages over goods from across the world. The Galata Bridge still spans the Golden Horn, connecting Europe and Asia, as it has for centuries. But the empire itself is gone, as vanished as the Byzantine Empire. It replaced, as forgotten as the countless other empires that have risen and fallen throughout human history. Its palaces are museums now. 1:22:58 Its mosques, tourist attractions. Its borders lines Sultan on old died maps. In exile the last in 1944, forgotten and impoverished. The last Ottoman prince died in 1994. A librarian in New York. Working as the dynasty that had once ruled half the world ended, not with a bang, but with a whimper. Yet something of the Ottoman spirit survives in the cosmopolitan neighborhoods of Istanbul, where Europeans and Asians, Muslims and Christians still live side by side. 1:23:31 in the Turkish still language, carries words borrowed from Arabic, Persian, Greek, and a dozen other tongues in the Turkish cuisine, which blends flavors from across the former empire, and perhaps most importantly, in the memory of what was possible. For 6 centuries, the Ottoman Empire showed that different peoples, different faiths, different cultures could live together under a single banner. It wasn't perfect. No human institution ever is. 1:23:56. But at its vision of unity that transcended the narrow boundaries of tribe and nation. That vision failed, destroyed by the forces of nationalism, imperialism, and modernity, but the need for it remains in our interconnected world, where the challenges we face, climate change, pandemics, economic inequality, terrorism, transcend national cooperation. New ways of thinking about identity and belonging. The Ottoman Empire cannot be restored, nor should it be. The world has moved on, and the conditions that made the empire possible no longer exist. But its memory reminds us that human beings are capable of creating institutions that are larger than themselves, that serve purposes greater than narrow self-interest. 1:24:51 The empire fell, but the dream of unity lives on. In the European Union, which seeks to unite diverse peoples under common institutions. In the United Nations, which tries to provide a forum for global cooperation. 1:25:11 In the countless international organizations that work to solve problems that no single nation can address alone. These modern institutions face many of the same challenges that destroyed the Ottoman Empire. How do you balance unity and diversity? How do you maintain legitimacy across different cultures and traditions? How do you adapt to changing circumstances without losing your essential character? The Ottoman experience offers no easy answers to these questions, but it does offer insights. 1. Shows us that diversity can be a source of strength as well as weakness, that tolerance and pragmatism are more effective than ideology and rigidity, that institutions must evolve or die. It also reminds us that all human achievements are temporary, that even the greatest empires eventually fall, that nothing we build will last forever. But that doesn't make the building any less worthwhile. 1:26:04 The Ottoman Empire lasted longer than most nations have existed. It left behind a legacy of art, architecture, literature, and law that enriches the world to this day. And so we come to the end of our story. The story of how a 600-year reign came to its end. The Ottoman Empire is gone, but its echo still reverberates through the corridors of history, reminding us of what we have lost, and perhaps of what we might yet build. 1:26:32 The tree that grew from Osman's chest has withered and fallen, but seeds that tree have scattered on the wind, and who knows where they might take root. History, after all, is not just about endings. It's also about beginnings, and every ending, if we look closely enough, contains within it the promise of something new. 1:26:58 The Ottoman Empire died, but from its ashes rose nations, new ideas, new possibilities. The story of its collapse is also the story of the birth of the modern Middle East, with all its struggles and achievements. Perhaps that is the ultimate lesson of the Ottoman Empire, that even in failure, even in collapse, even in death, there can be renewal. The empire that called itself eternal proved to be mortal. 1:27:21 But the human spirit that created it, to build, to unite, to transcend the limitations of tribe and nation, that spirit is truly eternal. It lives on in every attempt to create something larger than ourselves, in every effort to bridge the divisions that separate us, in every dream of a better world. The Ottoman Empire is dead. 1. 2746. Dream that created it. The dream of unity and diversity. A justice and tolerance. Of a world where different peoples can live together in peace. That dream will never die. And in that sense, perhaps the empire was eternal, after all. Not in its institutions or its borders, but in its ideals. 1. 28. In its palaces or its armies, but in its vision of what humanity might become. The last sultan is gone. The last palace is empty. The last border has been redrawn. But the dream lives on, waiting for new dreamers to give it form, builders to give it substance, new believers to give it life. The Ottoman Empire is dead. 1. 28. 30. Long live the dream that created